Hey, estimating projected sales tax revenues for county budgets. Riveting stuff. So a little bit of background here from the Benjamin Center for Public Policy Initiatives at SUNY New Paltz. I'm sure most of you are probably familiar with my esteemed boss, Jerry Benjamin, the namesake of our institution. So we were hired to be the independent sort of auditors and analysts for the Ulster County Legislature to be able to look at the executive budget and the budgeting process. And this sort of research comes from that. So sales tax projections. There's a problem on the county level with the sales tax projections because the sales tax revenues for many counties counterbalance the property taxes for the county in order to balance the budget. Now, in estimating the sales tax revenues, you're kind of hitting a moving target, right? And your recent trend data is not necessarily particularly accurate in that the returns from the state come in as monthly estimates. There's reconciliations quarterly. Mid-year data is helpful, but your tax revenue payments are not evenly spaced throughout the year. And as you'll see in the sort of next slide, the entire November through December sort of holiday season, the tax revenues go absolutely haywire, and a lot of that has to do with the estimation and reconciliation process. So the past is not always a valid indicator of the future. This is true in a great many of things, but this kind of trend data does not really hold particularly true. And when you're looking at trend data, the most recent data that you have needs to be weighted the highest, because what happened 10 years ago in your sales tax, revenues really has almost nothing to do with what's going to happen in the next year. Your macro indicators and reporting trends are typically measured at the state and national level, and counties are estimating on a county level. Now, we each have microeconomies that differ greatly. The microeconomy of, Tompkins County differs significantly from Westchester County, and yet we still are tasked with being able to estimate the sales tax revenues in the budgeting process. And state estimates are skewed by sales and use tax in New York City, which has an economy unto its own. So then we deal with the technical sophistication from jurisdiction to jurisdiction varies greatly. I did a little bit of work on sales tax in 2009 for the Ulster County Comptroller, and at the time the county executive had an old budget director that was working with him, and he was kind of a holdover from the time before the county moved to an executive, a county executive system. And the guy had an excellent method of estimating the sales tax revenue. Unfortunately, it was impossible to describe to anybody because a lot of it, had to do with how he felt about the economy, what the price of the bagels were that morning, how many gallons of gas he could fit in his car at a given point in time. And it was just, and yet he was oddly accurate about the entire thing. And that's really just that kind of speaks to, the sort of influence of experience in these things. He'd been doing it for 20, 30 years, and he could, when he moved on, institutional knowledge was lost. I'll just put it that way. So the typical methodology in the few jurisdictions that I've talked to about this for estimating these revenues are simple linear projections using several years past data, as well as, a sort of double check on what the returns are coming in to see if there's wide variations from the previous year in that monthly time frame. It could also be argued that there's a perverse incentive on both sides to overestimate sales tax revenue and underestimate sales tax revenue, particularly in a system where there's a county executive. Underestimating the sales tax revenue affords administrators and executives a known buffer for other areas of the budget, right? It needs to be reconciled later on with a budget appropriation of the legislature, but if you know that you're underestimating your sales tax revenues, you build in extra money in your budget for emergency or unknowns, similar to the way that fuel costs are often padded. Basically, from my experience with budgets, if somebody can't come up with a couple $1 million budget out of an $80 million budget, they're not looking very hard. So this allows for something to be leveraged from purposes outside of the legislative budgeting process, and simultaneously serves to rein in legislative appropriations for projects that fall outside of the priorities of the executive. On the other side of things, in times where things are constricting, and as a short-term measure, there's a perverse incentive to overestimate your sales tax revenues in order to balance your budget and come in under this tax cap. And so, and it's an interesting thing because if you apply game theory to this, we're basically looking at the Price is Right. There is a great political cost to slight overestimations in the sales tax revenue, so that the people would rather be $2 million under than $250,000 over, because politically it looks bad to appropriate general funds to cover a budget gap due to an overestimation of the revenues. Whereas at the end of the year, the county executive, they underestimating, say, due to reining in spending and cost-effective, administration, we've come up with a budget surplus of $2 million. So, yep, I just basically covered this. What are the effects of underestimating and overestimating the sales tax revenue? So here is a look at the Ulster County 2014 through 2018 year-to-date when the analysis was being completed. 5 minutes, okay. Revenues. And so what you can see there, I mean, the important thing here is the end of the year, September, October, November, December. That greatly there's no predictive sort of quality to what's going on there. And I think that that frequently has to do with the way that the receipts are collected, estimated, and then funds reimbursed to the counties. Because if you look at January as well, clearly there's not that much variance. There's not a $6 million actual variance in the sales tax revenues collected in January. That's a reconciliation from the year prior. All right, so I wanted to come up with a better way to try and look at this. Unfortunately, this proved to be fairly difficult. But basically what I ended up doing is taking 5 years of data. I would have preferred to use 10 years, but the financial crisis and the housing market dropout made 10-year data really problematic. And so I used 5 years of data. And in one sense, I just did a straight linear logarithmic and polynomial projection of 5 years of data. Now, the logarithmic projection gives me my floor. Basically, that's something that's useful in biological population growth, where you see rapid growth in the beginning and then a leveling off. The idea here is to come up with two estimates that give a ceiling and a floor, and then estimates that fall within that range, and then basically average them. And as I said, this is a rudimentary methodology. So 4 and 10 years of average growth gives me a strict growth percentage. The 2018 consumer spending growth percentage and the 2019 sales and use tax for the governor's budget, that gives me my ceiling. Ulster, a county in New York is never going to outperform the governor's executive budget sales and use tax projections, and I'll allow you to draw your own conclusions for that. So these were the sales tax projections for 2019. These were based on the 2017 actuals, and you can sort of see, I apologize for everything being so small there, but I think that our estimation there fell at about $120 million when we averaged all of the various methodologies. And yeah, there we go. And that's kind of the range in which they fell, and you can see the governor's percentage growth estimate there, and you can see the logarithmic towards the bottom, and you can see the budgeted amount in the blue line that kind of falls along the bottom. And then this is based on year-to-date actuals with an estimation, and this actually ended up, the sales tax receipts for the end of the year ended up not holding true to the percentage above the previous year that we'd been seeing up to that point. And I don't have the January reconciliation numbers yet, and so I don't know what the actual final was, but that doesn't even really matter because the final total of actual will be rolled into 2019's sales tax collections, and so it's only kind of useful for academic purposes. And so what ended up happening? We estimated $120 million revenues from the sales tax, and then projected the 2019 sales tax to be roughly $224 million. By contrast, the county's budget was $117.6 for 2018 and $122.4 for 2019. Now, we're estimating higher growth there. So we basically got it within $50,000 for 2018. or 0.04%. So what's the issue with this rudimentary methodology? We got lucky. And so we had actually used a conservative estimate of our actual number on both counts. And I'm a little bit nervous about the 3.9% growth that we estimated for next year, especially given what the macro indicators. So what are our next steps? Right now I'm applying for a research stipend from IBM, and the idea here is that we're going to actually use machine learning to be able to solve this problem and to model it. And the general idea here is we're just going to take massive amounts of macro indicator trend data and local trend data, and we're going to use a supervised machine learning process to develop a model to be able to actually chew up this data and continue, and it will be constantly fed data, so the model will be continually learning. And this is sort of a cutting-edge thing, I guess, in public administration. Certainly, we don't see a lot of machine learning to be able to answer these questions. If we can actually get this thing working and be able to test it, then a similar methodology could be used for any number of fiscal questions in the budgeting process and things along those lines. It's also advantaged in that all of the estimations that we're going to be making are relatively short-term. So I don't need to know what the sales tax revenues are going to be 10 years out. I need to know what they're going to be in 12 months. And so I think that this is a very promising, potential for the future in these sort of practices. And once developed, could be made available to places that don't have the sophistication to actually be able to do this themselves. And I think that's pretty much all I got.